So, welcome back to Third Age Reforged and to another battle replay, and actually there has been a little change of plan, and I am going to show at least one of the hotfix battles now, because I have been given a sort of glut of replays that I do really want to do on the standard build of Reforged, the current 0.97 build, and so in an effort to make sure that these aren't buried and forgotten in the way that some replays that I get sent do tend to be because of the sheer volume that I do sometimes get sent, I'm going to do this one now, because obviously it is the hotfix, and it's nice to see it in action. Now, I have gone through some of the details with Kuro, like Kuro was kind enough to sort of tell me what the overall philosophy behind the hotfix and the things that it's going to be introducing is, and also going through each individual faction just to quickly let me know sort of what's going to be changing with each one. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail about that here, mainly because of course that affects all the factions. Some of the changes of course are universal, like unit types. For example, one thing is that shock infantry, and in particular heavy swordsmen, are going to be made a little bit more useful, both through some cost reductions and some minor buffs here and there, just to make them a little bit more worth bringing, sort of the more standard ones at any rate. And obviously that affects all factions, or at least most factions that have heavy swordsmen. But there are also individual changes, such as like ammo tweaks for individual units changing the kind of unit that they actually are. So yeah, we'll go through that a little bit closer to the time. I believe the idea is that sort of within the next month and a half perhaps, it will be finalised and ready to come out. Kuro told me it's less of a hot fix and more of a cold fix at this point because of the amount of work that's been done on it, but that's how it tends to be. Sort of development tends to creep up and up unless you put a bit of a cap on it. But this is going to be a free-for-all, and this is one of the battles that Death Eater sent me. So again, kind of an interesting format for a free-for-all this, because we have two teams that involve two armies, one team with just the one army. So there are three teams, but obviously it's a little bit lopsided. Sort of Harad over there are the wild card really, because they're on their own, whereas the two teams of two are Rhûn and Lindon. So we'll go through Lindon first of all. Lindon, very minor sort of note on their changes. They've been given a little bit of love in the hotfix because obviously in comparison to the other elves they do tend to be used a little bit less than the other elves, not because they're weak per se, but because, you know, they're just not as exciting as they used to be in comparison to a faction particularly like Lothlorien with all their fancy skirmishers, Mirkwood obviously with the Ents and all the hidden units that they can bring to bear. But, you know, Lindon do benefit from some of the universal changes. The Noldorin Guard, of course, are on the front line, a really nice unit of line infantry. Really, really solid, especially when you back them up with the 4 Lindon pikes. That's obviously something Lindon are always going to be really good at in comparison to the other elves. The sheer number of pikes that they can field, obviously Mirkwood lack them completely. Lothlorien and Imladris have more elite pikes than Lindon, but they can field them in far less numbers than Lindon are able to, so they can't really form a traditional phalanx as such, whereas Lindon very much can. Of course, the downside to that is very weak to arrow fire. You do need to compensate for that. A unit that's very much going to benefit from the buffs to shock infantry and heavy swordsmen are going to be the Mithlon Swordmasters. The elves in particular, their heavy swordsmen will be made more useful by this just in general, because of course the problem with elven heavy swordsmen has always been that they are very specialised troops. They're very situational, or at least they were in 0.97, and because of how quickly units like this tend to die, obviously if you lose 10 units in a human unit, that's going to be less significant than if you lose 10 units from an elven unit. So just in general, the heavy swordsman buff is going to be very useful for all of the elven factions, but obviously Lindon with the Mithlon Swordmasters, this is going to be a pretty good first look, I think, in seeing how effective they can be. Just in general though, if you could get the elven Swordmasters into melee without them taking too much damage, such as in like a defensive siege where it's a little bit easier to cover for their weaknesses, then they were always very effective. But now with slight reduction in price, very minor buffs in terms of their abilities in melee as well, you should see them a little bit more commonly rather than just the standard Harlindon infantry and the equivalents from other factions as well. Noldorin Blademasters, something which is a little footnote for them is they weren't actually locked morale in 0.97. That has been rectified because they were supposed to be. It was just something that was forgotten. But also worth mentioning is they haven't necessarily changed, but there is a unit which now certainly eclipses them in terms of being the best heavy swordsman in the game, but more on that when we talk about them. For here, just know the Noldorin Blademasters, they haven't been nerfed or anything, they are just as strong as they always were. It's just that another unit has been buffed to be a little bit stronger than them now. But the Noldorin Blademasters is still obviously an incredibly powerful unit. Harlindon Guard on the side, so obviously some archers, elven archers. Mithlon Marines, which now will fulfill a very similar kind of role to the Seafarers of Nindamos, so they are now more designed with damage in mind. Like, they're not going to be able to sustain their fire for as long, but honestly I prefer this. Like, the Seafarers of Nindamos are so effective, And Lindon, it makes sense for them to have a unit which is similar in terms of function to that. And I'm not sure whether the 4 Lindon Marines are like that as well. I would assume not. I think the 4 Lindon Marines are just the same as they were. So having sort of the differential between these 2 units is very good, I think, because they both sort of did the same thing at range anyway. So it makes sense to have them perform a little bit differently. And a couple of Mithlon pikemen at the back. So going for the pike and javelin approach, which is obviously what Lindon should be all about for the most part. 4 Lindon archers on the front line for Engsfitz, who's going to be Death Eater's ally today. 4 Lindon archers, of course, main weakness is going to be in a skirmish fight. Their very light armour doesn't exactly help them, but they do try to make up for that with their very strong offensive stats, very good elven accuracy, higher damage than most other entry-level archers from other factions as well, means that they can skirmish. But Lindon, you know, in an ideal world as Lindon, you don't really want to be sat at range for too long, because it's really not where you want to be as a very lightly armoured faction like them. But they can do it for a little while at least. Like, they're not helpless at range. They do have the tools to at least compete for a little while. Before then, you need to start thinking about getting in closer with your javelins and your very, very damaging infantry. Harland and Guard back here, very similar sort of thing, only you pay a little bit more for them, but of course spears and shields make them a little bit more resilient. 4 Lindon Marines, spears and javelins once again. Harland and infantry, so in spite of the fact that heavy swordsmen have been buffed, Harland and infantry are still going to be the safer pick in comparison to the Mithlon swordmasters as sort of the main bulk of your infantry line, because of course the shields do compensate for their light armour quite a bit, and obviously elven units like this are still going to have very high damage, very high melee defense. Lindon especially, because of course they essentially sacrifice their armour values mechanically so that they can gain that really high melee defense they're known for. As a whole, Lindon's melee defense is the strongest in the game, so that is obviously what they are all about. 4 Lindon pikemen as well. Phalanx units in general had a few sort of tweaks as well, but I'll go through that a little bit closer to when the hotfix releases, because obviously that affects far more than just Lindon, even if it does affect them quite a lot. They will still, pikes are always going to do the same sort of thing, however. Harland infantry and Mithlond pikemen on the front line. 4 Lindon Marines, more Noldorin Guard, more Mithlond Marines. I'm really interested to see how damaging the Mithlond Marines are in this particular battle. Noldorin Blade Masters and Guard back here, and then a final unit of Harland infantry as well. Now, having a look at the Easterlings who are going to be facing off against them, we have Retro Easterling, who's going to be playing as Rhûn, so he's clearly got a favourite faction. Narim here, so Narim, like Rhûn, their changes are few and far between, because as a faction they're very complete really. Like, you know, when you look at Rhûn, they have so many options that really it's just going to be minor tweaks here and there. Obviously a reduction in power of the Dragon's Breath cannon is going to be necessary, but that's a completely different matter. As for the main army, it's mostly the same. There are a couple of units which are going to be changed around a little bit. Narim are not one of them, however, they're still going to be much the same. We have Eastron Hunters on the front line, so interestingly enough, their armour values are obviously going to be quite similar to the Elven archers that are across from them, only individually obviously they're far less competent, but in terms of numbers, Rhûn will be happier with a long skirmish fight than Lindon will, so it will be interesting to see how Lindon decide to react to that. He's obviously got some Scion Rim and some Gamp Rim in behind here as well, so a really, really solid front line. Not necessarily going to be the best at dealing damage to Lindon though. Like, halberds are going to be outranged by the Lindon pikes, which means they're not really going to be able to do as much damage as they would like, and the armour piercing isn't going to be as useful against Lindon as it is against any other faction in the game. And the Scion Rim, while they are a really, really tough unit to break down, and even a faction who's capable of dealing damage as quickly as Lindon are, will take their time in breaking them down. Ultimately, they will be broken down. Like, heavy spears like this are very good for holding the line, but you do often need to sort of mix in some damage dealers as well to make sure that you're not just playing defense. You also have some Flagrim out here on the side. Once again, I suppose for Rhûn, like Rhûn and Lindon, it's a rough matchup for Rhûn in many ways, because Rhûn, while they are good all-rounders, they definitely do dip into their AP quite a lot, and that focus, and obviously that's least useful against Lindon. So the Flagrim, while they may not be as effective as they would like, and they will ultimately come out second best against quite a lot of Lindon's infantry, at least at the higher end, certainly. What else are you really going to bring as Rhûn? Like, you could bring like a fully numbers-focused army, which would be an interesting approach to take. But if you do want a competent front line, you do kind of need to bring the Flagrim, because they're a very solid unit of line infantry. But do bear in mind that the AP is only really going to be useful against the Noldorin units, and even then the Flagrim will still lose that fight fairly handily. Eastron Crossbowmen, interestingly enough, the Eastron Crossbowmen now have the same levels of armour upgrades as the other clansman units, so they will now have 2 levels of armour upgrade if you so wish, which will of course give them the golden armour, so you can have a fully golden army even if you do bring the clansman units, which is going to be interesting. Even with both levels of armour upgrades, though, the Eastron crossbows will still lack in terms of armour next to the really heavily armoured stuff like Cardlin and Erebor's crossbows. But it is interesting nonetheless, like it will mitigate the damage they can do, you just have to spend a little bit more on them. They're not as cheap as the clansmen, certainly, the crossbowmen. Carmel's chosen back here. This is another unit which, you know, Kuro is apparently looking at sort of trying to make a little bit better, which I do agree, the Carmel's chosen are a little bit plain as far as the unit goes. Yes, they're strong as far as the bodyguard unit goes because they're tough and they can sit in the middle of the line quite comfortably, but in comparison to other similar units, stuff like the dismounted Knights of Illuminus, the Carmel's chosen is just a little bit lackluster in comparison to that. So they may very well change, but for this battle I don't think it's necessarily the worst thing. I personally would have gone for a little bit more in terms of cavalry if I were Rhûn, but based on the army compositions that are here, I would imagine that the idea was to test out the infantry, because Lindon have got no cavalry, and Lindon's cavalry obviously is quite an interesting strength of their faction, so I'm going to go ahead and assume that that it was intentional that everyone just brought footbound units for this battle. And also Retro Easterling has some Variag mercenaries. This is, I've said time and time again, if you want to get involved in a really long attrition-y skirmish fight as Rhûn, this is really the best unit to base that around because they're not very expensive, they're pretty durable as far as an arch unit like this goes. They haven't got the armour upgrade, which would make them even more so, but the shield is still there, and yeah, I mean, it's definitely the sort of unit which Lindon is not going to like seeing on the other side of the battlefield, a relatively inexpensive, reasonably tanky archer which is just designed to outlast the Lindon skirmishers, which is exactly what they're going to want to bring. Misericordia is going to be playing as Rhûn. What is this? Misericordia. I'm butchering that. Regardless, I'm sure I'll get there eventually. if doing this has taught me one thing, it's patience with regards to my own pronunciation. Eastron Clansmen, though, again, unupgraded, so in terms of melee, they're obviously going to be suffering quite heavily against most of what Lindon have, but they're just here for the numbers. An ill-trained mob can still offer some mass to the front line. Flagrim and Gamphrim, so once again heavy AP focus from Rhûn. This is a very competent front line that they can field, but against Lindon it's not ideally suited, to be honest. We also have Variag mercenaries and some crossbowmen in here. I mean, crossbows, if Lindon do close in, which they will want to at some point, there is going to be a gap between sort of the effective archer ranges and when Lindon's javelins get into range where the crossbows can rule the roost, and that may be the time in the battle where Rhûn can stamp their authority. We shall see, because I think if Lindon close in without having too much damage dealt to them, their javelins and their abilities in melee are going to tear Rhûn asunder, so they're really going to need to be very careful here, Rhûn. It's definitely one of the more challenging matchups in the game, I think. Definitely for Rhûn. Baltroth Tribesmen here, so Rhûn are not helpless with regards to their own javelins, but they're certainly not as strong in this regard as Lindon across the way. But they can at least contest that, and to be fair, Rhûn have got the numbers to absorb the casualties that javelins can inflict on them. The elves a little bit less so, perhaps. And there's probably a few hidden units around here as well. That doesn't look like an entire army from Misericordia. Regardless, the final army on the field today going to be Harad, played by Chris Almighty. So in quick succession, we've seen Harad twice now, after not seeing them for a long time. Harad, one of the main differences that they have is that you can now bring the Southron units in bigger numbers, so trying to make Harad just maybe a little bit more than just spamming the trollmen and having the lower tier units to pad out the army. That is still going to be very much one of Harad's stronger moves, but just trying to make Harad maybe a little bit more well-rounded. Units like the War Beasts are also going to be reworked so that they're a little bit more of an attractive proposition to bring. Haradrim Spearmen, they're really just going to be here for their numbers. Like in melee, they're really going to be one of the weakest units on the field today. Even the Runic Eastron Clansman, fellow militia unit, is going to be far stronger than the Haradrim Spearmen in melee, and of course without any cavalry on display they can't even claim to be a decent blocker against cav. Haradrim Archers as well, they're going to be here for much the same reason as the Eastron Hunters are, just here to be a low tier archer which is going to be there to try and play that attrition-y game. Certainly another thing that Lindon will have to worry about. Lindon seems to be sort of caught between the evil factions as well, so while this is kind of a free-for-all, I mean, the way that this engagement is shaped, if Lindon play their cards right, Harad will have to go through Rhûn, but Lindon are also going to have to deal with Harad's skirmishers maybe poking and prodding at them, which may be a concern. Southron Archers are back here as well, so just a little bit tankier, fewer in number, but they at least have some form of armour on. And we do have a largely Mahud horde here played for Harad today. Mahud warriors, the line infantry. Not a lot of armour, as you would expect from savage tribesmen of the desert like this, but a decent shield value actually, and in terms of melee, like they have got decent numbers, they can overwhelm. Harad are an evil men faction after all, and while we do see them dip into a lot of quality with their trollmen, these savage warriors of the desert, while they may not be quite on that level, are still quite capable actually. And mixed in with them we also have the beast tamers for a phalanx. I always forget whether they're pikes or halberds. I believe they are pikes, which should give them the range to compete with Lindon if it comes down to that, but I might be wrong about that because you very rarely see them. If Harad do bring this sort of units, they do tend to go for the South Rhûn pikemen because of the AP. They may be quite poor in terms of their stats, but that AP is something that very few pikes have. In 0.97 I think they're the only pike to have it, but they're not in the hotfix. There are a couple other pikes that have gained that, most notably the 1st Legion. Mahud Beast Hunters as well. They're going to be here. Javelins, obviously Harad, very big focus with them. Alongside Lindon and Rhûn, they're probably one of the first factions you think of when you think of Javelins. Beast Hunters are the heart and soul of that. Berserkers as well, so this is definitely sort of savage tribesman style army, this from Chris Almighty. I like the theme. We also have the Champions of Nefrat, flanked by a couple of units of Trollmen, and then of course the ever terrifying Demons of the Desert are also here. They need to be careful about getting into range of archers, but if they do get into range, they're probably the scariest Javelins, to be honest with you, because of their high mass projectiles. But yeah, without further ado, let's begin. So this is going to be interesting. No cavalry, and again I would assume that's for testing purposes, because all 3 of these factions have got access to some pretty decent cavalry units, which you will often see at least one of them dip into it a little bit at least. Lindon certainly have got a relatively small roster of cavalry, but all of them are either really, really effective, like their knights, or a hybrid unit. So a lot of multifaceted units that Lindon have, and of course that's not going to change. Carl in the guard, so Death Eater is going to sort of tilt his perspective. Harad are going to move in pretty quickly actually with all their archers, and perhaps sensing, I mean this is absolutely what I would do. If I were Harad, I'd have a little look at the armies that were on display today. I'd look at Lindon, I'd think Lindon are going to have the measure of Rhûn in melee. So I think it's best if we try and maybe skirmish a little bit with Lindon, maybe try and give Rhûn some peripheral support, make it look like we're doing more than we are, and then sweep in the late game with a relatively healthy melee force to clean up whoever's left. That would be my thoughts if I were playing as Harad. If I were playing as Lindon, my first thought would be get away from Harad, don't let them do this, pull back over here, force Harad to go through Rhûn in order to get to us, because that will of course be a boon for us later in the battle if Harad is in no fit position to fight us. And if I were Rhûn, I wouldn't engage like this. These hills are an enticing proposition, but I'd follow Lindon along the map here. I'd make it so that don't get in Harad's way. Don't force Harad to come through you. Move over here, because certainly I think with the armies that are on display today, just having a look at who's strong where, I would back Lindon to win this fight normally. There are 2 armies there instead of just the 1. And in melee, they have the beating of Rhûn, certainly, because of the heavy AP focus that Rhûn have to go with if they're going for their golden boys, which they have. Harad are actually a different matter. Like Harad, they haven't gone as heavily into their AP as I was thinking they might here. Like the Trollmen, yes, they're AP, but they're a good pick regardless, because they're multiple HP, they're really, really tough, and even with their AP, or if you take away their AP from the equation, they're still a really high damage unit. They're effectively shock infantry with a shield, which is really, really strong, of course. The only units which maybe aren't so suiting against Lindon would be the Mahud Berserkers, but that's only a small portion of this very large Haradran army. Serpent's Fangs are here as well, another unit which you'll notice a change of, because they've had their unit number increase significantly, because they were very underwhelming in 0.97, to be honest with you. They look cool, the poison projectiles look cool, pretty good in melee as well, but as an archer, like as far as a bodyguard archer went, they just weren't on the level of other bodyguard archers. So not great for them. Haradran archers moving in. Interesting this. I mean, I think it might be that this isn't a free-for-all. I might be talking nonsense. It might be that Harad is, based on how the armies were laid out, I was kind of thinking, because Harad started off separately to Rhûn, and it had to be a free-for-all based on where everyone deployed. So I mean, Harad are definitely going to help out their fellow evil men here. And it's a very deft micro, if that's the case, to make sure that the armies don't bash into one another and start automatically killing each other. Already quite a lot of dead Lindon elves here, as this one unit of Lindon Guard taking a bit of a beating from all the low tier archers that are across the way from them. A little bit better at taking a beating than the 4 Lindon archers at the very least, thanks to their shields and slightly higher armour value. I really must stress slightly in that. 4 Lindon archers, meanwhile, I mean, they've got no real choice here, Lindon, if they're going to be ganged up upon by Harad and Rhûn. This definitely changes the complexion of the battle. I mean, Lindon are going to have to play very, very well to win if Rhûn and Harad are going to stay on the same team until Lindon are utterly vanquished. Lindon continuing to back up, however, trying to sort of make the map as narrow as possible, which, considering they are now certainly outnumbered, they absolutely need to do this. Otherwise they will be washed over, both in terms of ranged units and melee. So it'll be interesting to see how this battle develops for Lindon archers. Though you can see, even though they are the superior archer in terms of damage dealing, and they have done a lot of damage actually to the Eastron hunters already, they are completely out in the open. Easy hits for the runic archers that are shooting them, and most of these hits are going to result in a kill because of how lightly armoured the 4 Lindon archers are. And it is unfortunate for Lindon in a way, because Lindon, if it was a quote-unquote fair fight, what they would want to do is close into melee, I think, use their javelins to do a terminal amount of damage on Rhûn quickly, and then get into melee. Use their superior infantry, and make the most of Rhûn having more of an AP focus, and the sacrifices that comes with that to their advantage. But they can't be aggressive in this situation, really, because they'll just be swallowed whole by 3 armies. So I can certainly see why they're engaging in a bit of a fighting retreat here. And it may be that as they fight and retreat and as they take losses, Harad and Rhûn may start to look at one another and go, well, Lindon are looking like a bit of a wounded animal at this point. You now represent a bigger threat to my chances of winning this battle, so the alliance has to end here. But that's not going to be for the moment. Like, I think in particular, Rhûn need to keep Harad on side here. Because Harad, they've allowed Harad to move forward. If Harad so chose, they could cover the ground across here pretty quickly, and with all the archers pointing Lindon's way, they could smash in here. I mean, it would be foolish for Harad to do that and then be at the mercy of Lindon, but Rhûn, I think, like I said, I think the individual runic armies are a little bit less suited to facing Lindon. Like, it is, I can only assume, like, yeah, like, I do wonder if it's a free-for-all, but the deployment zones, like, it had to be a free-for-all. That's not a deployment zone of a 2v3. We'd be split right through the middle of the map if that was the case. Lindon continuing to pull back, and again, this is not too surprising, but they're pulling back beyond sort of this artificial narrow spot in the map, or I say narrow spot, in between this lake and the river. Well, this pond and the river, I suppose you'd call it, more so than a lake. It doesn't look like a particularly narrow choke point, but it's better than most of what this map has to offer. One has to wonder how far Lindon can actually retreat and get away with it. I mean, I suppose they could pull back to this hill over here, try and use it for a bit of cover perhaps, a bit of elevation, but it's a long way to retreat. It's a long way to be hounded continuously as well. Harad are moving in and continuing. The alliance between the evil factions continues. The Haradrim units, the spearmen, and the archers taking point. Very low quality, of course, but they stand to lose very little of their investment, even if they're defeated, without killing a single elf, and they will manage to kill a couple of elves at the very least, as the Lindon Guard continue to try and retreat. A few pot shots from the Haradrim archers manage to find their way into their backs, and the Haradrim spearmen making sure that Lindon can't suddenly turn around and be hyper-aggressive. I mean, that's unlikely anyway, but also any arrows that these Haradrim spearmen can absorb, Harad and Rhûn will be all too happy to see that. Lindon continuing to fire, and again, they don't really have much of a choice here. Like, it's not ideal when your archers cost more, and yet you're being forced to engage in a long slog against low-tier trash like the Haradrim archers. But you really don't have a choice in this situation as Lindon. Like, there are some factions where you can kind of get away with just allowing low-tier archers like this to shoot on your front line. Gondor or Khazad-dûm come to mind, where low-tier arrows are just going to bang against the shields and armour on that front line and not really be too effective. You don't really have that luxury as Lindon. If you allow low-tier archers to do that against Lindon, even your shielded line infantry will take losses over time because of the lack of armour, and even the shield value is not particularly high. It's still an important factor, of course, but it's not as big as other shield values are. Sort of an interesting fence here. Was this someone's sort of vegetable patch or something? Just out in the middle of nowhere? Meanwhile, trying to use it for a bit of cover, try and make the advance a little bit more awkward. Variag mercenaries coming forward. Again, this is exactly the sort of fight that the Variag mercenaries are going to be good in. Not necessarily for a huge amount of kills, but just their ability to absorb a lot of punishment. And they will do more damage than the Eastron hunters in front of them as well. Exactly. If you want to go for a sort of skirmish heavy army as Rhûn, definitely the way you want to go. The Rhûn are more common, I think, because they look cooler. Style's important, I agree, but honestly, I think the upgraded Variag mercenaries have got a certain charm as well. 4 Lindon archers continuing to try and fight, and still, the fighting retreat continues. Yeah, you can see they're giving one another a bit of a wide berth at this point, Rhûn and Harad. Like, they are exposed to one another, but if one side attacks the other, it will be a slaughter, and the only one to benefit from it will be Lindon, so I can't imagine that there's going to be any great rush for these two factions to turn on one another just yet. It'll take a lot more damage to Lindon before that becomes more of a possibility, I think. I'm going to look like a real fool when it turns out they were on locked teams all along. Lindon Guard and 4 Lindon Marines pushing across. I mean, Lindon are quite fortunate this is an infantry-only game. Because of the gaps that happen when you start to pull back like this, if there had been cavalry, some of the heavy cataphracts from Rhûn, or some of the swifter riders from Harad, the gaps that formed could have been fairly terminal. Lindon have got a lot of spear hybrids and of course a lot of pikes in their line, which makes it a little bit more tricky for enemy cavalry to do that, but the lower numbers of the elves means just one good charge is going to be something that's really worthwhile to try and get. Variag mercenaries shooting in. Oh, excuse me. Trying to do a lot of recording while I still can. Next week's probably going to be fairly busy, so my opportunities to do so are going to be few and far between, and it's taking a toll on my voice. 4 Lindon Marines taking damage. There's the projectile of the Rhûn. Interesting aesthetic note, if nothing else. The runic chariots are going to have the same cosmetic fire arrows now that the Rhûn have, which is nice. I really do like the Rhûn fire arrows. Like, the fire that they leave on surfaces looks especially striking in a siege, because it tends to stick to surfaces for a little while and catch fire to them. And it certainly looks pretty cool. Meanwhile, over here you can see that, yeah, Lindon, very much not at home in this kind of situation. It's a really tricky situation for Lindon to be in, but one that Rhûn will be absolutely delighted with, because in melee, as things were at the start, they would have been dreading fighting Lindon, but if they can whittle them down enough to where they can just smash them to bits with their heavy-duty units like the Scion Rim and Flag Rim, even despite the fact that Lindon's units are stronger individually, the numbers discrepancy will be too great after a mauling at the hands of all these archers. Harad are also moving in. Again, I think Lindon's best hope here is that they take enough losses that Harad and Rhûn start to view one another as the greater competition. Like, Lindon are just going to have to accept the fact that they're going to take a bit of a beating here in the early game, and hope that it's not too great as we progress into the later stages. Eastron Hunter's still here. But yeah, this, at the start of the map, this would be exactly the sort of thing that Lindon would be hoping to avoid. A long skirmish fight, attrition-y, the sort of thing where sort of heavy plate armour and big thick shields are going to be the sort of thing which increase your chances of winning, because that's just not Lindon's style, it's not the way they do things. Variag mercenaries getting on top of this hill. Very similar unit in terms of function to something like the Belagire archers. Nice buckler to give them a little bit more resilience against enemy archers. The armour values are decent. The price range for them is very reasonable. A unit I've got a lot of time for. Rhûn have got a lot of decent units though. They've got a little bit of a scattershot approach to their faction. Like, AP is the only thing you can pin on them and say, yes, this is what they are good at. Other than that, like in terms of unit types, ranged, cavalry, melee, very balanced approach to Rhûn. One of the best factions to start off with when you're learning the game, I think, because you've got so many options where you can still be competitive. They may not be absolutely exceptional in one particular area, but they're, other than AP of course, but they're good enough in most areas, I think, where you can definitely be competitive. And if you were blind picking a faction, I'd be really tempted to go for Rhûn. Tournament setting, perhaps? blind faction picks, blind map picks. Rhûn are capable of being good on in most settings, I think. Arthedain would be another one, although Arthedain perhaps... Well, I mean, yeah. Arthedain and Rhûn, I would say. Best jacks of all trades in the rosters. Lindon continuing to just be peppered at range. The Harlingen Guard having a flaming shower there from the Rim. Lindon trying to sort of bunch up over here again. There's a pretty decent spot they can use, using the water to form sort of makeshift choke points. They're getting into the trees as well. Can they hide in these trees? That may be their best option. Like, if you can hide, it's one of the things which make Mirkwood quite an awkward faction to fight against, because they're not that much better in a skirmish fight than Lindon like this. They are superior to Lindon. They do have better armour than them at least, but it's still not ideal for them. But one way they can completely circumvent being involved in a skirmish fight is to just hide. Most of their units do hide. Some of their most of their lower end units certainly hide, and it can make them really difficult to draw out into that skirmish fight. If they don't want to take it, they'll just hide. Lindon don't have that luxury, generally speaking. 4 Lindon archers being engaged by Eastron hunters, and again, the numbers being what they are, the 4 Lindon archers having taken so much of a beating at range, even a unit as poor as the Eastron hunters in melee are going to be able to overwhelm them. You can see there, it's only a matter of time before Harad. And just to keep goodwill, it's going to take quite a lot of effort to avoid these units from bumping into one another. Harajim archers and spearmen moving forward. I mean, Harad, this I think is quite a savvy move from Harad, because they are sending forward these units. But I mean, it's not a huge committal in terms of the amount of money they've spent on their army. Like, they've got all of their values back there. This is just a token effort from Harad saying, look, Rhûn, I'm helping your efforts to damage Lindon. But really what Harad will be hoping for here, in the event that it is a free-for-all and I'm not making an ass of myself, is they're going to want Rhûn to take most of the damage against Lindon. And this is interesting. If Lindon do decide to really come forward against Rhûn here, which I think is actually a pretty good idea. I mean, it's a narrow engagement. Harad is not going to be able to get across here in time to quote-unquote help. Even if they do, Lindon can actually set up a bit of a rear guard here to stop the Harajim army having such an easy time of it. And in melee is where Lindon want to be. If they allow this fight to continue at range for too much longer, I think their manpower is going to be depleted so much that they're going to really struggle to come back from it. Flagrim are charging in, trying to prevent the Eastron crossbowmen from being engaged. The Harland infantry are going to continue, ignoring the angry mace and axe wielding infantry that's just behind them. Easier said than done though. Like, this unit is pretty isolated at this point. But the main body of the Lindon army coming forward, and I can appreciate this, to be honest with you. And I mean, this might have caught Rhûn a little bit off guard. Messier Corday's army is going to come forward to try and help out Retro Easterling now, because his archers have been caught in melee. And the Variag mercenaries, while they can defend themselves in melee, like, it's not really a main focus of the unit. And of course against Harland infantry, and especially against Noldorin Guard, they are going to get absolutely butchered. And in come the pikes rather. Pikes are a prime target for ranged units if they're able to get in there. Harland infantry, meanwhile, taking shots in the back. They're not going to last very long, but they have at least pulled some runic resources over here, including a very significant one in the shape of the Carmel's Chosen. Meanwhile, Variag mercenaries, were those javelins? Yes, they were. Mithlon Marines, they're actually firing into the front line, and several casualties there. Perhaps the first example of how damaging they can be. Dragon's Wrath Crossmen in the next patch, at least temporarily, I think, will be made to be more like the Blacklocks, because as they were in 0.97, of course, they were relatively useless at what they were, particularly for their price point. They were just too awkward to use. Lindon, meanwhile, a bit of a rear guard going on here, just trying to make life a little bit more difficult for Harad. These Harajim spearmen are going to get absolutely torn to pieces by Mithlon swordmasters, but of course, they're just here, sacrificial lambs, pinning these elven swordsmen in place, allowing the Harajim archers to get the damage done. And then the main body of Harad's infantry, all of their good stuff, will be completely unharmed for the late game, and they're looking pretty good here. Lindon, I like the fact that Lindon forced an engagement against one of them though. It was either die on your feet or die on your knees. Variag mercenaries isolated here. The Lindon forces are taking ranged fire, but the Variag mercenaries will fall long before the Lindon troops give way here. Mithlon Marines are fighting. The problem is here, the front line is, the numbers are pretty tricky here. Like, the Dragon's Wrath crossbowmen as awkward as they are to use, they had a perfect shot there, which is rare for them. But they've done damage. Also from the other side, the runic crossbows, they're being pincered. But Engsvitz's army is battling through, and if he hurries up, he will be able to save Death Eater's offensive through the middle. And if he can shut down these runic ranged units in melee, Lindon have got such a big advantage, considering Rhûn's focus here. The Gamprim are going to try and come in to try and shore up this line against Death Eater, but it's not going to be successful, and Lindon are going to win this fight. The problem is, in order to win it, they'll have to commit forward everything, and I don't think this rear guard is going to last too much longer. Where's the rest of the Harad army? They're just sat there. I mean, Chris Almighty knows, but I mean, there is the possibility that one of Lindon or Rhûn, depending on routing, ranged unit damage, how well Rhûn's front line stands up, I mean, there is a possibility that one of those two factions manages to win it comfortably enough that his army then won't be sufficient. I mean, over here, the Mithlon Swordmasters have completely destroyed the low-tier Haradrim that were going after them, and all Death Eater needs to do with these two units is prevent Harad from moving anywhere. Pin them in place long enough to allow them to deal with Rhûn, and then hope they have enough to withstand the onslaught from the Trollmen and all of their Mahud underlings. Meanwhile, these crossmen trying to do the business, but Mithlon Marines, you can see a good example actually. In 0.97 they would have still been throwing their javelins with ammunition. However, they've already run out and they're getting into melee, which may seem like a bad thing, but the damage they did to the front line was actually fairly significant. With only a couple of volleys, they managed to kill off a really good portion of the Gamprim, and over here, the tide has turned now. The Dragon's Wrath crossbows not able to do as much damage as they needed in order to turn the fight in their favour. Mithlon Marines now are also doing the same thing to Rhûn as Rhûn did to Lindon with the crossbows, only with javelins, and it really is only a matter of time before Messier Corday's front line here completely falls apart from the Lindon assault. The Noldorin Blade Masters are on the front line. The Lindon Pikes have taken a decent amount of damage, presumably from all the ranged units that are buzzing around the field here. Over here, Engsvitz is at least engaging with these units over on this flank. But the real danger is back here. Engsvitz's Noldorin Blade Masters alongside some Mithlon Marines that are now in melee. The difference between the Noldorin Blade Masters and the Carmel's Chosen, as far as the damage dealing infantry unit goes, is very significant. And even with the support of the Gamprim here, Lindon are going to do terminal damage to this runic flank you would expect. And Lindon do still have a couple of units in reserve. Meanwhile, what's going on over here? Yeah, the routing of the Mithlon Swordmasters. Like, when you're faced with a full Harad army and you're a battered and bruised unit of light elven swordsmen, there's only going to be one way you're going to be heading, and it's not towards the fight. But at the very least, they've delayed Harad, and Harad now probably won't want to move in. Like, they're just going to leave their former allies Rhûn to their fate. Death Eater's flank has actually made more progress than the other side, which is interesting. But a lot of that has to do with the density of javelins down here. Like, they really did a ton of damage, and Rhûn is buckling under the pressure here. In come the Shadow Guard, but once again, it's a strong unit, the Shadow Guard. It really is, in terms of the damage they can deal. But again, it's an AP focus which is just wasted on Lindon. And it's a rough matchup for Rhûn. It really is. But Rhûn have better compositions, I think, to face Lindon than the ones that the two Runic players went for here. Like, the Runic players went full in for their AP units, which is puzzling to me against Lindon. And Harad. Like, it's not even as if the Chris Almighty picked a faction that was heavily armoured. Although, actually, having said that, I think I know what happened here, and that is another feature which is going to be introduced in the hotfix, and that is that you don't actually get to see the, at least not initially, you don't get to see right from the off what armies your opponent has actually picked. So it's sort of like a blind picking thing, which is, that may have been what happened here, because I can't imagine, Messier Corday especially is a player I've seen in action before, and I don't think he would have gone for a full AP focus like this if he knew it was Lindon he was fighting. As it is though, I mean, you have to make use of the tools that you have, and 9 times out of 10, Rhûn will go for this sort of heavier AP focus. But if they don't know who they're facing and they end up facing Lindon, it's going to be rough for them in that respect. It's not the sort of matchup which is going to happen commonly, but it is still something to consider. And yeah, Rhûn have been scoured from the field well and truly. I mean, Lindon are going to be victorious, but Lindon's army now is battered and bruised. I really don't know whether or not they're going to have the strength left to withstand an assault from the Harad, and especially when you consider that Rhûn are not completely dead and buried yet. Like, they're trying to pull back, they're trying to make it so they have at least something left in the tank for the late game. Those Shadow Guards trying to run, the Baltroth Tribesmen are here trying to reform, get a decent position to fire their javelins in from. Noldorin Blade Masses moving all over the place. These Mithlond Marines should, yeah, good choice to try and finish off these Eastron Crossmen. Don't allow crossbows to survive into the late game, whatever you do. Variag Mercenaries. Yeah, I mean, in a free-for-all like this, when you're this weak as Rhûn are now, one of the best things you can do is run away and hope that in the late game you have the numbers to come back and win. But the player that will be most pleased with how this has gone has been Harad. I'm sure there'll be a little bit of hate for him in the comments, just because playing in this way in a free-for-all doesn't tend to net you that many friends, being extremely passive in the way that he was. He was very savvy as well, with the way that he sent forward only his really cheap units in the initial sort of ganging up on Lindon. Like, I know what he's doing there. Like, he's trying to make it look like he's doing something when really he's not doing a whole lot. Which is the wise thing to do. It's not necessarily the sporting thing to do, but it is the wise thing. We shall see, though, if his trickery is going to net him the victory. I think it probably will, to be honest with you. If Lindon and Rhûn have got any sense between them, they'll stop ripping into each other at this point. As tempting as it is to continue to just slaughter each other until one side completely falls, you have to recognise the strength that Harad still have left. Champions of Neferat that are untouched, 2 units of Trollmen that are untouched, Javelins, including the mighty Demons of the Desert that have not used a single bullet. I say bullet. A throw. A single piece of ammunition. And also all of the right support around them. So plenty of Mahud units which will form a very solid battle line. May not have a lot of armour in much the same way that Lindon do, but at this stage in the battle, just having as healthy an army as they do is a real boon. And we shall see if it's going to be enough to give them the win. Mithlond pikemen going to form. Rhûn's still firing away on Lindon. The temptation for this would be to try and avenge your defeat at the hands of Lindon by continuing to go after them. But I would kind of like to see Rhûn put that aside, because time and time again we saw in one of the last free-for-alls anyway, Cardland seek to take revenge on a faction that had done a lot of damage to them, but in so doing they kind of sealed the result of the battle in many ways. Whereas if Rhûn do join Lindon in facing Harad, I do feel as though there is still a chance that Harad may not win the fight. And I feel as though Lindon would be the ones to most likely take advantage of that. I don't think Rhûn have got enough left to really have much of a chance. And also, one thing that Rhûn cannot think they can get away with is allow Harad to face Lindon without any assistance from them. Because if they allow that to happen, I think Harad will swallow Lindon whole. As much as Lindon's troops are very scary in melee, and even when they're fighting a losing battle, elves do tend to take their toll. When the numbers discrepancy is this large, I don't think that will be enough to make Rhûn's very small army competitive against what Harad will have left. But we'll see. Lindon are going to try and split their forces. Again, can they coordinate? Harad and Rhûn coordinated quite nicely in close proximity to one another in the early game. Lindon are going to send some infantry, presumably to attack against this hill. Rhûn should attack near the lake, and then the rest of the Lindon army should definitely hold Harad's attention from the front, because if it does come down to a pure choke point fight at this point, Lindon have lost far too many of their pikes and infantry, and the combination of Mahud units here should be more than sufficient to win an attrition-y melee fight, especially with the backup from the Trollmen they're likely to get. Demons of the Desert pulling out wide, interestingly enough, as far away from the action as they're likely to get, at least initially. Meanwhile, the Poison Arrows and the Serpent's Fangs, they could be fairly interesting in this late stage. Could be enough to force an already flagging army to break. Interesting to see if that happens. Southron Archers, I mean, this is a good point. These Southrons probably do have sufficient ammo to continue firing for a little while. Not sure whether the same can be said of the Variag Mercenaries, considering the fact that some of their number were in melee. Mithlond Marines are moving forward. Mithlond Marines, they still have ammunition actually, and I think they were trying to get close enough to do some damage to the enemy javelins and to the enemy front line. The Harad Archers were here, perhaps trying to stop them from doing that, but instantly routing to the Mithlond Marines, who of course are decent line infantry in their own right as well. Lindon trying to concentrate their forces over on this side of the Harad army, but they're going to need to do more than this. Death Eater's going to need to come in as well to assist Engsvitz's push, because Engsvitz is pretty much going all in here. I mean, I think this is the only thing Lindon can really do. Chris Almighty, though, I mean, at this point, with sort of all of the Lindon troops coming from this angle, as well as all of the runic troops, like, he needs to just sort of reorganise his front line over here, get all of his line infantry and phalanx units to just go here like this, sort of horseshoe around from the hill to the lake. Because then, I mean, in order to get in behind that phalanx, Harad, like, either Lindon or Rhûn are going to have to go the long way round, which it's easy to see when that's coming, and it's then easy to simply readjust again with all the numbers that you have available to you. Engsvitz is in melee, but he's alone in melee, which means he's really going to start to struggle. All of these javelins coming in, champions of Nafrat and all of the Mahud units. Again, individually, Mahuds are going to be no match for the mighty high elves of the far west. But it's not one-on-one. Harad's numbers advantage is huge, and to be fair, the Mahud units do tend to be decently damaging for what they cost. What they lack in armour, they do make up a little bit in terms of pure damage. Very fitting for Harad. It's amazing, really, when you think of Harad and Rudauer, how similar their philosophies are. They achieve them in different ways, but very similar philosophies, and yet they're about as far away as two factions can be. So are Lindon and Harad, really. Even more so. Beast Hunters, meanwhile, out in front, maybe getting a little bit greedy trying to use those javelins, and now they're going to be sort of mobbed by elven heavy swordsmen of varying degrees of quality, but any heavy elven swordsman is going to be enough to finish off a unit of Beast Hunters in melee. AP, they do pull out those little maces, but that's more of a little quirk of theirs more so than a genuine strength, in the way that it is for something like the Minhiriath units, for example. Mahud Berserkers, I mean, they could get away with sending some units around the flank. I think Death Eater has maybe dragged his heels a little bit here. Engsvitz has kind of paid the price, while he's been sort of manoeuvring around. And he may very well have been utterly destroyed as well, if moving in from the front, but Engsvitz's army has been surrounded and is breaking in the time that Death Eater has sort of been manoeuvring behind this hill. And now the momentum is with Harad, as you would expect, and they really needed all three of the armies, the two Lindon armies and the Runic army, needed more of a united front than they've ended up putting up, I think. And on the front line here, just the sheer brute strength that Harad still have, I think, is going to be too much. It's a rather intimidating sight, isn't it? All these tribesmen wielding with all those skulls adorned on their, not really their armour. I'm not really sure what to call this back thing. Just these stakes that they wear on their back. Death Eater is now clambering over the hill, and he still has pikes. The problem is, I mean, I still think the Demons of the Desert are around here somewhere. Indeed they are, so I mean, all it really takes is the Demons of the Desert to be committed forward, and this sort of Lindon wing is going to be utterly vanquished. Mahud Beast Hunters moving in. Dragon's Wrath crossbows, still with a little bit of ammo. Could be significant, but you can see here just swamping forwards. Chris Almighty doing exactly the right thing here. Sees the weakness. Obviously Rhûn's army was in even worse shape than Lindon's, so it's going to take even less to finish them off. Those Dragon's Wrath crossbows are going to try and do what they can to get some kills, and several of those Beast Tamers fall, but they're not going to be able to do enough damage quickly enough to really have much of an impact. Shadow Guard are moving around, crossbowmen going to try and move around, but it's not been a united enough effort between the two Lindon armies and the Runic ones to stop Harad at this point. Like, it's been very scattershot. Engsvitz moved in, didn't get enough support quickly enough. Death Eater was around here. Rhûn sent some stuff forward, but they're sending stuff around. Like, what was the purpose of sending stuff around if all of the stuff over here is now pretty much gone except a single unit of Shadow Guard? It's going to be an easy enough task for Harad, if they play their cards right, to just sort of turn around from their thing and just one by one destroy each pocket of resistance. But it is what it is. It was always going to be difficult, I think, after Lindon and Rhûn tore into one another in the way that they did. Harad were always going to be fairly heavy favourites going in to the late game. And when you're alone, like, it's not as if Harad's single army, I think, was better. I think based on the army they had, they probably had the same amount of funds, or at least a very similar amount of funds, to the individual Lindon and Runic army. So it's not as if he could use his forces in the same way as Lindon and Rhûn. He couldn't throw his weight around in that way. But in the end, he's played it well. Like, you have to say, like, a free-for-all, this is exactly what you need to do. Especially if you're outnumbered, especially if you start off on a bit of a back foot. You need to ingratiate yourself, make yourself less of a target, and then as the fight goes on, I mean, Demons of the Desert are over here. And you can see over here, the Demons of the Desert have sort of returned fire, getting involved in a skirmish fight, which is not often where you see the Demons of the Desert skirmishing with crossbows, but just look at the damage they do in a single volley against a lightly armoured unit. Well, a lighter unit like these strong crossbows. Armour is not going to do much to stop the Demons of the Desert, to be honest with you. They're going to tear into you regardless. Carmel's Shadow Guard getting overwhelmed by Serpent's Fangs and several units of Mahud Berserkers. There goes the Runic General. Cut down by those wicked looking swords that the Mahud use. It's interesting, they look... Are there African swords that look like that? Because they look more like Pacific Islander swords. Like you see those like shark tooth kind of weapons and that sort of thing. That's the sort of thing that comes to mind when I see most of Harad's weapon. The Mahud Berserkers especially, that weapon looks exactly like the sort of thing that a Polynesian would wield. More so than an African weapon. But I might be wrong. It might be the sort of thing that African tribesmen would also use. My knowledge of such things is relatively limited. I mean, Balchos Sapphire Bladesmen, this is actually quite a lot of hidden units that have suddenly revealed themselves. I mean, Balchos Sapphire Bladesmen are okay. They're not quite on the same level as Demons of the Desert as a sort of late game match winner. A couple more units of Carmel's Shadow Guard, some Variag Mercenaries. I mean, to be fair, all that needs to happen now is for Lindon to reveal that they had 2 units of Warden's Velos Tyrian all along, and all of a sudden, Harad are looking worried. But I don't think that's the case. I think we've probably, well, I mean, we'd have seen if Death Eater had any, but it's possible Engsvitz could have had some, I suppose. I mean, I still think Harad, like, in terms of pure melee, like, 2 units of Shadow Guard are all well and good, but they're going to have to try and batter their way through Trollmen and Champions of Nafarat still. It's going to be closer than I thought it would be initially, but I would still make Harad the heavy favourites going into this sort of last-ditch attempt by Rhûn to try and get something from this game. Lindon, they were the punching bags early on, and perhaps unsurprisingly they're the ones that have suffered most in this fight. Rhûn, maybe not being entirely forthright. I mean, to be fair, I think there is a very real case for saying that Rhûn should have committed all these units earlier, alongside Lindon, been a little bit more forthright with their temporary allies and tried to crush Harad while they had the chance. As it was, I think they've allowed Harad to gang up on individual pockets of resistance a little bit too much at this point. And I think they're going to probably struggle, especially seeing as Harad still have a couple of units of depleted archers, but still that's going to be at long range. The Sapphire Bladesmen need to get far closer before they're going to be useful. The poison arrows, the regular arrows, I just think Harad are going to have a little bit too much, and I think Rhûn, with those hidden units, they may very well have won if they had come in from the side sooner. They would have stood a better chance at the very least. But again, those are the judgments you make. And I think Harad has played this free-for-all very much by the book, and I think he is going to be rewarded for sticking with convention. Some archers that are out of ammunition. I mean, to be fair, Southron archers are not really up to much, but all they need to be is a meat shield for the Haradrim here. I mean, Harad needs to be maybe a little bit more proactive. In an ideal world, you don't want the Shadow Guard to willingly get a charge on the Trollman. I have to say, I don't think his line construction has been particularly good, Harad. He's been quite fortunate that he hasn't really been tested with regards to crafting a front line in this battle, because he's had a fairly decent advantage in most battles he's been in. If he had been involved in more even fights, the way that he's chosen to construct his lines, at least in the early stages of most fights, could have proved to have been a little bit more costly than they ended up being. Sapphire Bladesman, another unit Kuro told me he's going to try and make a little bit better before the hotfix comes out, because certainly in comparison to the other really high-end javelins, they're a little bit underwhelming. But in melee they're decent. They may not have the highest armor values, but they're still decent. A strong unit to say the least. There go the Variag Mercenaries, already battered and bruised, not wanting to go into melee with Trollmen, so that's 50 more soldiers routing and running for the hills. Demons of the Desert, I mean, even in melee they're going to be fairly significant. Carmel's Shadow Guard, Serpent's Fangs are here. I mean, these Carmel's Shadow Guard are actually just being mobbed by mostly archers. There's some Mahud warriors in here as well, but it's mostly just pure numbers that Harad are using to try and bring down the Carmel's Shadow Guard, and the Shadow Guard will take their toll, but ultimately there simply isn't enough of them to swing this fight into Rhûn's favour, I don't think. Especially not if the Demons of the Desert still have ammunition. But this is relatively close when you consider that Harad was a lone player. He doesn't have, like, he has taken damage doing this, and Rhûn will continue to fight until the bitter end, taking more chunks out of Harad's manpower. But obviously, there's only going to be one winner here. Interestingly enough, Engsvitz's general is here. The bearded elf himself trying to prevent the demons of the desert from firing and getting a few more kills. He will of course fall eventually, especially if all the demons turn their attention to him in melee, but sort of making life a little bit more difficult than he would like. I mean, certainly a couple more volleys into the Sapphire Bladesmen and they will be utterly vanquished. Do Lindon have a hidden unit? Is that the fate of this battle? Warns of ITHILIEN coming in with the steel chair. Is that the future that awaits? Well, there goes the general. What's that over the hill? Routing units? That's the same unit of routing Beriac mercenaries. Yeah, and I mean, it was always going to be a problem to try and bring down the brute force of Harad. Like, Harad, they're a very damaging faction, infantry-wise anyway. To leave them so healthy until the late game, like when you're facing down champions of Neferat, Trollmen, all backed up appropriately, it's a difficult thing to stop once it gets rolling. They're definitely a faction which works best when they're on the front foot. Harad being aggressive, using their more damage focused armies more proactively, and they just bided their time, and when the time was right, Chris Almighty moved forward. Lindon and Rhûn at least didn't keep tearing into one another to the point where this wasn't even worth showing at the end. But you have to say, while it has turned out to be relatively close, Harad does deserve the victory in many ways. This was a free-for-all, and this is how you win a free-for-all. Dragon's Wrath Crossbowmen taking damage from the Serpent's Fangs. Slowly but surely. They're not the most damaging bodyguard archer, to be fair, but over a long period of time they will end up winning. Kamal's Shadow Guard, interestingly enough, going to get a lot of friendly fire by doing that, I think. A lot of units do get back up from a Demons of the Desert volley, but that is friendly fire. In come the Dragon's Wrath Crossbowmen. Not going to last too long in melee, I don't think. Especially not with the poison arrows, to be fair. As soon as they get close to some of the scary Harad units, the morale debuff from both the fear-causing effects and the poison arrows should be enough to send them routing. Certainly, the Demons of the Desert javelins will be enough to send them to their graves. But yeah, there we go. Good victory for Harad, but a relatively small army left, you have to say, and most of it is elite units. So, like most of the Mahouds laid down their lives, there's a few Southrons in there, a few Mahoud Berserkers, but for the most part it's Trollmen, and it's Serpent's Fangs and Demons of the Desert. So, I mean, Harad also had a massive army. Like, they had a fairly significant lower tier. Like, the Mahoud units are not overly expensive, like I said. Low armor values, like in terms of quality and all around units, like the Serpent Guard are probably where you want to go, because obviously armor is better. Just in terms of their melee skill as well, they can keep themselves alive better. But I think there is a real case for bringing the Mahoud in a lot of situations, because Harad, for quality, like generally speaking, how many factions can Harad really go toe to toe with in terms of sheer quality and win that way? I feel as though Harad are a lot more comfortable when they have numbers to play with, when they have a lot of units that they can use to defend some of their key assets. Stuff like, you know, Hashari Rangers, for example, or Javelins. This was very much a traditional Harad army in the sense that they had their Trollmen and their Javelins as their primary focus. A little bit different from what we saw in a lot of .97 stuff, in the sense that they went for a lot of Mahoud, rather than going for maybe a mix of Serpent Guard and Southrons. Which is nice to see, but also something we may be seeing Harad do a little bit more of. Assassins is something else which are going to change quite a lot of, in the hotfix, or cold fix as it's been dubbed recently. And Harad have got access to Hashari, which, considering the changes that are going to be made to them, which I'll go through at a later date as well, that may very well prove to be a bit more of a viable option as well. So, exciting times for Harad. Exciting times for Lindon as well, in spite of the fact that they were very much the whipping boys in this fight, I think. They did alright. Like, considering the deck that was stacked against them, they took damage from both Rhûn and Harad, but they managed to sort of turn that against Rhûn and do a terminal amount of damage to Rhûn, to be honest with you. Rhûn's army, in spite of the fact they did have those hidden units in the late game, which, if they had used those against Harad sooner, could have been a different story. If they had been maybe a little bit more forthright with Lindon and tried to genuinely help them a little bit more, rather than waiting for too long, I think it could have been different, and I think Rhûn maybe could even have won. but the damage they took at the hands of Lindon was significant, and a lot of that has to do with just the faction matchup. If Rhûn do go AP heavy, that's obviously not going to be great against Lindon, because Lindon are all about melee defense and having those nice damage values, and it's not the sort of thing that Rhûn are going to match up favourably against. And certainly I think that showed. Lindon took damage before engaging, and even with that, Lindon were able to brute force themselves into a pretty good position in melee, and then their javelins just twisted the knife against Rhûn, really, and their front line collapsed. But you kind of expect that, considering the armies that were on display. And I think everyone played quite well. I think it was the army certainly didn't help Rhûn. I think that, you know, in terms of play, they didn't do much wrong considering what they had. But you know, that's just how it works. I think maybe Harad, actually, you could probably poke the most holes in how he played, because some of the ways that he constructed those lines towards the end, I feel as though if Lindon and Rhûn had been a little bit more complete, or if Rhûn had gone all in with their hidden units, he may very well have been punished for reacting fairly slowly. But that's a very minor complaint, to be fair. I think Harad and his judgment on the macro scale was very good, and that's why he ended up winning the fight. And Lindon, of course, odds stacked against them, and they still were able to put on a very good fight, as you'd expect from the elves, even when it's clear they're going to lose an engagement, when they're horribly outnumbered in that way. They're still going to be able to put on a good enough show to really cause the other team some concern. But let's see what did the damage for Lindon. Noldorin Blade Masters in melee, once again showing their quality, as you would expect. A heavy swordsman like that is obviously going to be enough to do a really significant amount of damage. The Noldorin Guard also doing okay for themselves. Not as attack focused, of course, and not multiple HP, but there are more of them, and you can spread them out across your army a little bit more, and they definitely help add to the quality. And of course the Noldorin units in general have got the armour that the rest of the Lindon faction does lack. A lot of kills on the archers, interestingly enough, as well. So in spite of the fact that they were, for the most part, torn apart, they did get a decent amount of kills, but it's worth saying most of those kills were on the likes of Haradrim archers, clan hunters, not really high quality units, so those kills are probably worth a little bit less, to be fair. Harland infantry did okay, the rest of the army, yeah, the javelins and the high quality infantry was what did the damage for Engsvitz's army, and for Death Eater I'd imagine it's much the same. Harland, yeah, javelins again, javelins very much actually. You can see here the Mythlon Marines in 0.97 regular. I don't think you see the Mythlon Marines get a kill count like that, and this is because obviously they bear a little bit more in common with the Seafarers now. So this sort of low ammunition but really high damage unit of javelins, which doubles as a unit of line infantry, which can be used afterwards to sort of plug holes and the like. So definitely the sort of unit which I very much approve of, because the Seafarers obviously are a massive part of why Numenor are so successful. And I think these changes to the Mythlon Marines kind of change the whole dynamic of Lindon. They make them a much more appealing faction to play, in my opinion. Definitely makes up for some of their shortcomings, I think. Pikemen, 311 kills on a unit of pikemen, so when they got into melee they did the business most certainly. And the Mythlon Swordmasters, good to see them do well as well, because obviously one of the focuses of the hotfix has been to make units like that a little bit more effective. So big thank you to Death Eater for sending this one in. There was another one as well that he sent me on the hotfix, I believe, although I think when I was sort of looking through that, I think it was on the grassy plain. So we'll see. I mean, it is the hotfix, so I do feel a little bit more compelled to do it, but grassy plain, man. It's hard to get excited for the grassy plain, even though it's the best for testing purposes. I agree. It's it's hard to feign enthusiasm about that. I much prefer maps like this with a lot more interesting stuff on it. Interestingly, something else as well, which I might go through in the beginning of my next video. To prevent battles getting buried, like I was worried this one might get buried, because obviously with a glut of new stuff coming in for the regular build, I was worried I would forget about this one. One thing to help me not forget about replays is to give the replay a distinctive name when you send it to me. Like if it's just called sort of like 3v2.rpy, chances are I'm more likely to forget about that than if one is called the name of the map that you're on. For example, Austin Eri. Both the players that sent me that siege, which happened a couple of days ago, had it included in the name, so it was immediately obvious to me what it was and what it was all about. Whereas if you just send me sort of like Great Battle or sort of 3v2, something like that, it's much more difficult to sort of know what it is. And I don't skip out on replays by intention, but due to the volume that I get, some do sort of fall through the cracks, as it were, and to give it a distinctive name is something which will make it far less likely for that to happen. So just a little aside, like if you are really keen for me to use the replay, one thing that certainly helps is if you include the name of the map that you use. Unless it's grassy plain, of course, in which case it gets bumped right down to the bottom of the pecking order. But yeah, big thank you to all the players involved. Big thank you to Death Eater for sending this one to me. And big thank you to all the developers for the hotfix stuff and the hotfix news. Obviously, Kura especially for sort of talking me through what some of the stuff to be expected in the future will be happening. And like I said, I think about a week or so before the hotfix is due to be released, I'll make a little video on it, sort of explaining and detailing all of the differences, depending on when it is. Because if it does creep into sort of mid-March, there is a sort of week where I'm going to be away, and I will schedule content, or at least try to schedule as much content as I can for that little gap. But obviously, if the hotfix, if that's when he wanted me to make the video, obviously it would have to be delayed a little bit because I'm not going to be around to do it. But we'll see. We can work around that. That's obviously not a matter for now. Next video will be returning to the regular build of Reforged, because Sin I think sent me a new map and a battle obviously on said map that he wants me to show, called the Adunheim Outpost, which I think will probably be the next one, considering regardless of how long it is, next recording session will be on the weekend, which will allow me a little bit more time to do that. And there are a few others as well which I got sent on the regular build, which will follow as well. So yeah, and also like I said, if there's some more stuff with regards to other stuff on the channel, it will be in the shape of a channel update. But Bannerlord is creeping ever closer, and that will probably be sort of the form that the new content takes, probably. But again, these things are always fluid. I'm loath to commit to something because obviously things can change on a dime, which is why I don't plan too far ahead, to be honest with you, because I really, with my schedule being what it is, it's kind of hard to do that. So it's just better to go with the flow, I think. So yeah, hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you will join me for whatever is next.